I think it would be difficult for me to overstate how excited I am about tonight. This man has been very impactful on my thinking. I think he's been transformative in the lives of millions. And it is my hope to have a very deep, meaningful, insightful dialogue today about this lovely Bitcoin rabbit hole that we're all falling down. With that, I would like to welcome to the stage Dr. Jordan B. Peterson.
I don't know if I've had talk show music before.
I've waited a long time to say this, but Dr. Peterson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here.
Glad to have you. I thought we would just kind of cut straight to the heart of it. I'd like to talk about the concept of fiat. And we hear a lot about fiat currency in the Bitcoin circles, but I think the original fiat, as I understand it, and I'd love for you to correct me where I'm wrong, is this concept of fiat lux, when God said, "Let there be light," right? There's the original decree that started all things. And it's my perception that all human acts of fiat are basically attempts of man to play God, right? We're trying to impose, someone speaking fiat to another is trying to impose his opinion on someone else. And it seems to be an interruption to that dialogic process that engages us in truth discovery and meaning and whatnot. So, and we tweeted a little bit about this back and forth. I think I tweeted out, volition is the only sustainable binding to socioeconomic systems, which that sounds complicated. Basically means all interactions need to be voluntary on both sides. Otherwise, optimally. Otherwise it breaks down.
Yeah, that's a good goal.
Yeah, and your response, you mentioned this, as John Piaget demonstrated, by the way, it's also why psychopathy is, to put it mildly, a suboptimal strategy. So I would love for you to expand upon that. I've barely read a little bit of Piaget, thanks to you, but I'd love to hear your perspective on fiat and the necessity of mutual voluntary exchange in human relations.
You know, Piaget did a lot of, so Jean Piaget is often known as a developmental psychologist, and developmental psychologists study the development of children. He didn't term himself a developmental psychologist. He regarded himself as a genetic epistemologist. And epistemology is the study of systems of knowledge, and perhaps an investigation into what makes a system of knowledge valid. How do you know what does it mean for knowledge to be valid, let's say, and how do you know that it's valid? And how do you distinguish between a system of knowledge that's valid and one that's invalid? And so that's epistemology, the study of knowledge structures. And genetic meant not genes, but beginning, as in Genesis. Now, Piaget was actually interested in bridging the gap between science and religion, by the way. That was his fundamental motivation. I'm just telling you that to put this all in a broader context. But he believed that philosophers would have had a better time trying to understand the structure of structures of knowledge if they looked at how they developed, because they would develop from simple forms to more complex forms, and even if we couldn't necessarily understand the more complex forms, we might be able to understand the simpler forms, and those would manifest themselves first in children. So that's Piaget's take on the world, and he was interested in a very wide range of topics, one of which was the development of morality in children, and that's where Piaget wrote a lot of books, and I haven't read them all, and God only knows how much, a lot of it isn't translated either. God only knows how much unmined wisdom there is in Piaget's lesser known books. But he believed that children played games because games were social microcosms. And he believed that games, by their very nature, for them to be games, had to be voluntary. And that optimal games were optimally voluntary and simultaneously enjoyable, and also devoted towards mutually shared ends. So, for example, you could imagine two different kinds of play. One might be the kind of play you'd engage in a formal game like baseball, and another might be pretend play. And in baseball, you specify a goal, and everyone who's playing accepts the same goal. People often think of games like baseball as competitive, and there's been some attempt among boneheaded educators to insist that the only valid games are cooperative games, but for someone as sophisticated as Piaget, that whole idea was a non-starter, because people don't bring a basketball to a baseball game. And so what that means is that the mere act of agreeing upon the goal, which obviously you do in a game, was fundamentally cooperative, right? That's the landscape. It's almost like you could think about it as a constitutional agreement in some sense, right? What are we here for? Well, we're here to play ball. We're here to play baseball. Okay, well, we're not going to debate that. That's the cooperation. Well, now we can undertake the next goal, which would be perhaps the development of our athletic prowess, or perhaps victory in this particular game. It's not so obvious exactly what the goal is, but there's different levels, and that has to be played voluntarily. Right. And it's the same with games of pretend play. Children will sit down and negotiate their roles, their fragmentary identities for the purpose of the game. They'll act out the spirit of what they're mimicking, because Piaget was also extremely interested in imitation and wrote in a very sophisticated manner about imitation. And we'd assign roles, and then we'll run the simulation voluntarily. And one of the points that Piaget made was that, well, a number of them. One was that there's something key to what we regard as morality itself in that process and experience of voluntary engagement. It's really profound, you know. So imagine when you're a child, you have a play partner and you're having fun. Well, what does that mean exactly? I mean, those are the sorts of things we don't tend to think about because they seem so obvious that you pass by them without further notice. But why is one game fun and another game not fun? And then you might think, well, can there be a not fun game? And you think, well, yeah, but it's a pretty lousy game. It's not one I'd like to play. And Piaget's notion was, if it's a game that you wouldn't like to play, then it's ill-structured. It's immoral. He believed that the act of voluntary play in childhood was the precursor to the establishment of ethical societies. And that's a hell of an idea. It's an unbelievably profound idea, a remarkable idea. And he believed furthermore, so not only that the game was a microcosm of society, and he meant that technically because it would be, imagine that as you become more sophisticated, as you move towards adulthood, your games become more sophisticated simultaneously, and at some point the game merges into adulthood. You say, well, adulthood's not a game. It's like, well, then you're not playing it properly. Well, I mean that. I really mean that. And it's again almost impossible to overstate how profound an idea this is. Well, my marriage isn't a game. It's like, well, that means it's suboptimal. Because it should be voluntary, right? The interactions that you have with your partner should be voluntary, and you should both want to do them, and they should be self-maintaining as well. And if they're voluntary, they're much more likely to be self-maintaining because you don't have to maintain them by force. You don't have to expend energy. So, and I'll close with this. Sorry for the lengthy answer, but it's ask a complicated question and get a complicated answer. Piaget also believed that, imagine you had a game that was devoted to some end here and a game that was devoted, another game that was devoted to the same end here. So two identical games, but here's the difference between the games. The players in one game are forced to play, and the players in the other game have chosen to play. And Piaget's hypothesis was that over any reasonable amount of time, the game with voluntary players would outcompete the game with involuntary players, because some of the energy in the game that could be devoted towards the game, let's say towards productivity, for example, would be wasted on enforcement.
Right. And
it's wasted more than that, because, if you have to force, well, then you also don't have positive emotion working for you. The genuine enthusiasm that comes with voluntary engagement. And so here, an optimally structured social institution, even if that's just one person and another, say in the course of a marriage, if it's optimal, it has a game-like nature. And it's voluntary, it's based on voluntary association, and it maintains itself without external compulsion, and it has that playful spirit if it's done properly. And that's a good principle for analyzing your relationship with yourself, your relationship with the topics that you consider, your relationship with your family members, your relationship with your friends, and also the structure of broader social structures. To the degree they deviate from desirable voluntary game, they deviate from ethical optimality. And that's all tangled up in Piaget, and much more as well, but that's a good start. And
that's a great start.
Yeah, it's something, man. Yeah.
So, a couple of things I'd love to pick up on there, because I've followed your work on this. So, one, just be the comment that morality emerges from play, which I think was also Piagetian. And what you described there was the equilibrated structure versus the equilibrated structure.
Right. Yeah.
Voluntary versus involuntary. And that the voluntary game actually economically outcompetes the involuntary game, because it has to spend resources on enforcement, turf protection, things like this.
Yeah.
Whereas the voluntary game...
it also doesn't optimize motivation. Piaget didn't talk about that specifically, because he didn't, that I know of, because he didn't know the necessary psychophysiology or psychopharmacology. But, well, first of all, we know now, for example, that if you take on a challenge voluntarily, you have a very different psychophysiological response than you do if that challenge is imposed on you involuntarily.
Yes, exactly.
Completely different psychophysiological systems are activated. So if it's voluntary, the systems that are activated are much more likely to be associated with positive emotion and are much less psychophysiologically demanding. So you'll experience the involuntary challenge as a stressor. And the problem with that, say, well, what's the problem with being stressed? And the answer to that is, well, you're more likely to die if you're stressed. I mean, stress, you have finite resources, and you burn up more of those resources if you manifest a stress response. So it's not nothing. It's extremely important.
So you may know where I'm going with this next, given the namesake of the show and whatnot, but the fiat currency central banking complex is by definition imposed by fiat. It is involuntary, technically, in terms of the rules of the game are changed all the time, right? We don't know how many US dollars are in existence. We don't know the criteria for deciding. We don't know the shareholders of the central bank. We don't know the inflation rate. We don't know where the money is. It's a black box, as I was describing to you earlier. Would that have some impact on us psychologically, playing this game where the rules are changing all the time? And as a secondary question to that, is there any justifiable use case for fiat in human relations?
Well, kids don't like games that have rules that change. That's the equivalent of a constitutional crisis, essentially. Like if you're arguing about the rules of football, you're not playing football. I suppose you're engaged in politics, and so that's not fun. And especially in the earlier stages of child development, this is something Piaget pointed out too, children tend to regard rules as unshakable moral axioms, and as anybody who breaks the rules as a heretic and a danger. Later, children can start to understand, some children become sophisticated enough as adults to understand that people are not only those who abide by rules, but those who formulate rules. But that requires a fairly sophisticated level of psychological development. But mostly, we don't like changing rules. You know, I mean, you can have pretty harsh parents, and as long as they're predictable, you can do just fine, but it has to be predictable. But if you have the sort of parents who are changing the rules nonstop, it's like, well, you can't derive any certainty from your surroundings. And you might say, so what? It's like, well, no. Your response to uncertainty, your response to involuntary uncertainty is a stress response. And that ages you and hurts you. And if there's enough uncertainty, it depends on you to some degree, because some people can handle more uncertainty than others, all things considered. But generally speaking, we don't like uncertainty at all. I mean, that's why, for example, all of you are sitting facing forward in your chairs. And if one of you was sitting in this auditorium with their chair reversed, looking at the other direction, there'd be a space around that person. And that's because you want all the primates you don't know to do exactly what they're expected to do when you walk into a room full of strangers. And if they don't, if they evince any behavior that's outside of the domains of civilized predictability, everyone becomes extremely uneasy, like extremely uneasy, very, very rapidly. So we want certainty.
Right,
we want predictability. And so if the rules of the game change on us, well, we can't get a purchase on things, so to speak.
So in the fiat currency complex, not only do we have a less economic model where it has to expend energy on enforcement and protecting its turf that doesn't exist in the voluntary game of Bitcoin, but we also have a system that's driving people crazy, right? You can't even preserve your wealth across time in fiat currency. You don't have property rights. So in that world where you cannot store the fruit of your labor across time, how can you establish a relationship that's predictable with the world and get ahead? It just seems like a system that is designed to break down, sort of axiomatically deduced as we're doing here, but also historically, they all fail. And with that failure comes the disintegration of civilization. Mises wrote about the Austrian business cycle theory, which I know you've talked about. I would expand that out to a civilizational cycle theory. We've had the boom and bust of civilization based on the corruption of money. So is it ever justified? Because this seems, and we'll get into truth.
Well, I think it's suboptimal. You know, ever is a large term, right? I mean, people suggested, for example, that the COVID epidemic was of sufficient potential magnitude to justify policies that essentially relied on force. Because, let's be clear about this. Mandate's a point of the gun, fundamentally. Because, and you say, well, no, not really. Yes, really. Because not immediately, right? There's steps in between you and the gun, but that's still what's at the basis of it. And I would say, I think this is a good rule of thumb, and I think it's worth applying to all of your affairs. If you have to enforce with force, with compulsion, that's the sign of a suboptimal strategy, at minimum.
Right.
Now, is that ever necessary? Well, yes, unfortunately, it is necessary, and it's necessary. You talked a little bit about psychopathy. The question is, what do you do with people who won't play by the rules, no matter what the rules are? Well, and you think, well, in an optimally structured society, no such people would exist. It's like, good luck with that theory. Well, lots of people believe that. The Rousseauian types, and they're usually social utopians. This is why the communists regarded criminals they weren't enemies of the state, because they were criminals because they were victims of a corrupt system. And if the system had been optimally structured, there wouldn't be any criminals. And so you could hardly blame the poor criminals. You could certainly blame the political prisoners, by the way, under that system. But you had to actually feel sorry for the criminals. It's like, you're a fool if you feel sorry for people who are truly criminal, because they sure bloody well don't feel sorry for you. And you might think, well, there's no people like that. It's like, that means you haven't met one. That's all it means. So there's in every society, there's a small proportion of people who will use deceit, compulsion, extortion to gain their ends. And
so in response to that,
in response to that, well,
but in
yes.
a non-responsive situation, it seems difficult to justify at least.
Well, as I said, it's at least suboptimal,
yes.
right? I mean, if this theory is correct, or if this theoretical approach is correct, and I think there's all sorts of markers of its suboptimality. One would be, you don't want to play with someone who is forcing their game on you.
Right.
That's not trivial, because you think, well, why use the phraseology of game and play? Well, play actually turns out to be something of far more significance than we might think. You know, it seems likely that when you go to a movie, you're playing. That's a form of pretend play. It's a form of imaginative play. Whenever you're doing anything you really want to be doing, you're playing. And so the notion that optimally structured systems operate under the necessity of fostering voluntary play, that's a hell of a good idea.
Right.
And one of the things I really like about that idea too, this is really cool. So I've been beating the drum, I suppose, to some degree, making the case that there's an unholy alliance, you might say, between postmodern theorists and neo-Marxists. And you know, the neo-Marxist types, let's start with the Marxists, we'll get to the neo-Marxists momentarily. The Marxists have a particular view of history. And the view of history is basically an economic view, and I won't argue about the utility of that momentarily, but it's a particular economic view, and the economic view is essentially that there is an exploiting class, and there is an exploited class, a bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the reason the exploiting class, the bourgeoisie, have excess resources is because they've basically stolen the excess labor of the proletariat for their own nefarious means, and inappropriately, and as a consequence, because property is theft under this sort of theoretical rubric, we need a revolution to
abolish private property.
Yes, and that's right, and to bring the utopia into being. Well, so what's interesting about that, there's many things, but one of the things that's most interesting is that theory is basically predicated on the idea that the relations between people are governed by force, by power, right? By compulsion. And the communist types lay that at the feet of capitalism, which is, I think, the most clueless thing they do, which is really saying something, because there's no shortage of clueless things they do. And so to find the most clueless thing is, that's quite something. But you know, because to equate the use of compulsion with capitalism just strikes me as absolutely preposterous. I mean, you could say capitalism, if you were cynical, you could say, well, capitalism is one manifestation of the proclivity to use compulsion, and that would be a more appropriate argument. But to equate the two...
Well, and in pure capitalism, there's no compulsion, right?
Well,
it's all mutual voluntary exchange.
Right. Well, I certainly wasn't making a case for the communists,
yeah.
but the case I wanted to make is, you might think, well, if it's not power, if it isn't the willingness and ability to use compulsion to govern our social relations, like if it isn't mutual exploitation, what might the antithesis of that be? The opposite of that? What else could it be? And I think it's the spirit of play.
So let me... Thank you. Well said. I would like to pivot into a very important topic, which I think is related: truth. I want to give a couple of definitions. I would love for you to correct or share any of your own as well. But one was truth as just being an accurate portrayal of reality. I think that one's pretty obvious, right? We're constantly dealing with representations. The closer that representation is to the reality, the more truthful it is. whether this is the word or the picture or whatever it may be. You often talk about higher resolution versus lower resolution relationships. And then another definition that I think is very useful, this is from the American Pragmatist, they describe truth as the end of inquiry, meaning that truth is that which inquiry is always aimed, right? And then we're in this ongoing process of inquiry, largely through the market, but also through dialogue and things, trying to get closer to truth.
Close enough. That's
Close
why
enough.
that's such a brilliant phrase. The
Close
end
enough
of
to be
inquiry.
useful, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, close enough to suit your purposes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm very attracted to pragmatist accounts of truth, because one of the problem with the idea of truth is, well, what the hell do you know? Right? Fundamentally, you're ignorant of almost everything, and so you're wrong about everything. And so how do you manage? And the answer is, sometimes what you know is good enough. And that's the end of inquiry.
Yes.
And so are you right? And this is something the pragmatists, especially William James and his crew, C.S. Peirce, this is the only true school of American philosophy, that's the idea. They knew this very, very well, is that it's true, what you know is true if when you implement it, the object of your desire appears.
Yes.
Sufficiently.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and that's a very different notion of truth compared to, say, like an account of objective material reality. Right. And I think the pragmatists, I think they're right.
So one way I've framed this, it's a map joke. If the map gets you from A to B successfully, is because the map was useful or the map was true. They become almost indistinguishable at some point, right? So,
yes.
So utility and truth, there's a pragmatic truth that is utility itself.
Yeah, the map, if that's right, if the map, and a map can be pretty damn low resolution.
Yes.
Like if you wanted to sketch out a map for me of how to get from here to there,
right,
you could just use a couple of extremely base schematics and that would do the trick.
Right.
And so I know that the truth versus, what did you say, reality, truth versus real, that's a complicated issue, but the map is true enough.
Right.
Right.
So to tie this back to fiat a little bit. So fiat is effectively substituting that process of inquiry and saying this is the answer, right? Don't ask any more questions. Do this because I said so at the point of a gun, as you described.
Yeah, fiat more broadly conceptualized, because to order by fiat is to say by decree.
So, right, so isn't that then interrupting the process of inquiry, which would then necessarily move us away from truth?
Time's up. I think sometimes that's the case.
Yeah.
I think that would be the case when you're actually not satisfied by the consequence of the decree by fiat. Right? You're forced to be satisfied by it.
Aren't you always dissatisfied by the decree by fiat? Otherwise, the decree wouldn't be necessary.
No. Sometimes people tell you the way things are and they're right. Now, not very often, but if you provide me with a map, for example, you say, well, this is the map of the territory, and if you follow this map, you'll get to the wall, and then I go find out that I get to the wall. It's
so you could force someone to use something that's useful, basically.
You can. Yeah. Generally, you don't have to force someone to use something that's useful, because you might also point out then that if you have to use force, generally speaking, that means that it's not useful enough.
Right.
Because if it was useful enough, people would just do it. So
fair enough.
Because the problem with the way that you formulated the question was that it's not easy, given that formulation, to distinguish fiat from knowledge, from a priori knowledge. So if I have some knowledge and I share it with you,
they could be the same.
Yes, definitely, and hopefully would be a lot.
Right.
And I don't think it's reasonable to always assume that truth is only found in inquiry, because you do have this problem, which is, well, sometimes inquiry ends because it's good enough. And then, you think, well, then it's on to the next inquiry. Fair enough, but it still brought that to a halt.
Yeah, I guess I view markets as maybe like the yin to the yang of state, and that they're ongoing processes of inquiry. Like, what's the best way to satisfy human wants? Faster, better, cheaper. Yeah, we have the state model over here, legislation by fiat currency, trying to impose certain knowledge structures.
Yeah,
I understand there may be a necessary balance there, but we seem very weighted now towards this yang model of like, do this because I said so, use this money because I said so, call me this pronoun because I said so, like.
Yeah, well, Piaget did identify the spirit of truth with the process of inquiry. So there's an analog there. So his book on the development of morality in children, there's Play, Dreams, and Imitations in Childhood. Play, Dreams, and Imitation in Childhood, I think is the name of the book, and another one called The Development of Morality in Children. And those are the ones I would particularly recommend, given your interest in this particular topic. But certainly, that process of inquiry is the process by which truth is generated. So that's more relevant to your question. It's the process by which truth is generated. So part of the reason, here's a way of thinking about that. I think it goes down the right rabbit hole. Why do you have the right to free speech? And so you see a lot of conservatives now, they're trying to pull the wool over the radical leftists' eyes by saying, well, you guys are all hepped up on diversity. How about viewpoint diversity? And I don't really like that formulation because it makes the freedom of speech, the idea of freedom of speech, subordinate to the idea of diversity, which is a really, really bad idea. In any case, why do you have the right to free speech? Well, you might say, so you can say whatever damn thing comes into your head. You know, it's part of the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. It's in some sense, it's even an allowance for your own personal hedonism. And so it's a freedom in a personal sense. You know, you're free to speak as you see fit. But I don't think that's actually why that freedom of speech is the cornerstone of a civilization. I think the reason it's the cornerstone of a civilization, and necessarily so, this is associated with your idea of markets, is that you have the right to free speech, so you have the opportunity to pursue truth. And if we... And then, you know, we could extend that a little further. We could say you have the right to free speech so that you have the opportunity to pursue truth, and you should take that opportunity on as a responsibility. I think that's a nice triad. Okay. Why? Well, the answer is associated with what you're driving at in terms of your opposition to fiat. It's like, well, have we got everything figured out? Because then fiat would work. Just do what you're told, or do what everyone else has always done. That's sort of the conservative approach, but the rules already encapsulate what we need to know. It's like, so just follow them. No, it doesn't work. And the reason that it doesn't work is because, and this is why fiat doesn't work in the most fundamental sense, in the way you're referring to it, is that the future is incomputably different from the present and the past.
Right.
And we have to contend with that. And the question is, how do we contend with it? And the answer is by thinking and by exchanging those thoughts. And thinking and the exchange of thoughts, that's made possible in societies where you have the right to freedom of speech. You can't think without that right. And if we adapt to what's changing by thinking, which seems to be, I just can't see, are you going to mount an argument against that? It's like, what the hell do you think thinking is for? I mean, it even works out neurophysiologically, because the part of the brain that we use to think abstractly grew out of the part of the brain that we use to voluntarily sequence our actions. And so what that means is that thinking is action abstracted and analyzed before being implemented. And so what's the idea there? Well, if you think, you can have your thoughts die instead of you. And so you have free speech so that everyone can think, and that doesn't mean everyone's right, but the free speech is also a social phenomena, because each of us can maybe think a little bit, and now and then we have an idea that, you know, isn't fatal, and maybe if we can think and talk to each other freely, which is also thinking, then we can winnow out the ideas that we actually need to keep moving forward, and we can get rid of the bad ideas and we don't have to die.
Right. So it's a truth discovery process. Our ideas can go to battle and die so our bodies don't have to.
Right.
And this freedom of speech is very essential to Bitcoin itself, because that's literally all it is. It's just speech, just code, just language. Many Bitcoiners often say Bitcoin is truth, but I think these definitions, they actually map onto it nicely. We say that truth is the end of inquiry, right? We've been inquiring what is money via the market process for thousands of years. And now, even despite the fiat that's arrayed against Bitcoin, it's the fastest growing asset in human history. And if we look at truth in terms of being an accurate portrayal of reality, we say that money is time and energy.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
money, the supply of Bitcoin, for the first time in history, maps onto the thermodynamic reality of energy. You cannot create any more energy, you cannot create any more Bitcoin. So we have a tool that maps onto it perfectly for the first
I think
time
there's a deeper case to be made for that. So imagine that you have an incorruptible medium of, okay, let me see if I can formulate this properly. In principle, to the degree that the market, there we go, market is a computational device.
Mm-hmm. Distributed computation.
So what we're thinking here is the way we think is socially. We have to do it on a large scale because, well, we're too stupid individually. What do we know? You know, I mean, maybe 100,000 brains is better than one. And like I said, most of your ideas are stupid, and hopefully somebody will be kind to you and point that out before you go live it out. And look, we do this all the time because sanity is extraordinarily distributed socially. You know, part of the reason you maintain your sanity to the degree that you do is that your parents helped you become like minimally socially acceptable. And so other people can stand having you around some of the time. And then when you get too foolish, they smack you on the side of the head and you think, oh, maybe not that. And we're doing that to each other all the time, right? We do that with a raised eyebrow. We do that by having attention drift at a party. We do that by making a joke at someone's expense. Like, we are calibrating each other non-stop all the time, extremely carefully. And we're doing that while we're engaged in this collective computational exercise, which the market, the free market, best optimizes. And then if you have a incorruptible source of the free market endeavor, right? It can't be gerrymandered in any way. Then you hypothetically set up a situation so the least amount of interference with that computational process is possible.
Right.
Right? You're not putting noise into the system.
Maximal signal, minimal noise.
Yes, exactly. Because you think, okay, here comes the horizon of the future. Oh no, how are we going to compute it? Well, we're each going to make decisions of value, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is. And then the whole economy can adjust itself as people make these tiny, small-scale, multitudinous decisions. It keeps the whole thing alive and functioning. That only works if there isn't noise being introduced into the system. And so one of the things Bitcoin theorists push forward is the notion that you can't add additional noise to this computational mechanism.
Right.
And that might be right. This is one of the things that really made me interested in Bitcoin. It's like, oh, okay, no interference with, if the free market is a computational device, and if it's the device that enables us to adapt to the horizon of the future, it better be, because it's the only bloody device we have, unless you think central planners are going to manage it. It's like, good luck with that. That's just not going to happen. And if that follows, it's this micro-experimentation, you know, at every front simultaneously, with micro-failures occurring at the same time. You don't want noise that's not related to the actual environment introduced into that.
Right.
And hypothetically, that's what fiat inflation, for example, does. That's distortion of the market.
Falsifying the price signals that coordinate this distributed computing system we call the market, that's constantly allowing us to adjust to the ever-changing reality.
Yep.
And hopefully, you know, the other thing a market does is lets us accumulate more capital, so we're kind of pushing back the uncertainty in a way.
Oh, definitely.
The civilization is that bubble, right, of capital that we can buffer ourselves against the uncertainty of the world.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Well, so that's the secondary gain there. So you might say, well, on the one hand, you don't introduce excess noise. So see, we could go one level deeper underneath this. It looks to me like we actually perceive the world through a structure of value. And the reason I believe that's the case is because you have to prioritize your perceptions, because you can't look at everything, right? So you only look at what's important. Well, what's important? And the answer is you don't know. And so how do we calculate that? And the answer is, at least in part, we calculate that with free choices of value in the marketplace. And so, and you can think of this very straightforwardly, because you will look at, all things considered, you'll look at what other people are looking at. Right? And so the market actually shows you what's of value. Right. And you should pay attention to it, because if a bunch of other people think it's valuable, that might well be valuable. And so you don't want anything to interfere with that structure of value that our perception itself is predicated on. And then you made a secondary point, which was, well, also, you don't want anything to interfere with your ability to store value for the future.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's a completely, is it a completely independent benefit? I don't know if it's independent, but it's certainly a big benefit.
Right. Yeah. I think the Austrian economists would say that the higher fidelity or predictability of the money supply, let's say, the more clear the rules of the game are, less noise in the channel, as we've said, and people are free to accumulate more capital. So this idea of Bitcoin being the pristine economic coordinator gives us perfect price signals in a way. So it lets us remap to reality much more quickly, drives innovation, drives wealth creation, all of these things.
There probably isn't any difference between being able to store value for the future and being able to trade with other people without distortion, because the trade is a form of storage for the future.
Right.
And so it's just an extension of that, right?
Yes.
Because partly what you do to store value for the future is you distribute it into other people.
Yes.
And pull it back when you see fit.
Yeah, every trade that's voluntary, you're doing it only if it's incrementally valuable to you. So that would, in theory, if it's a voluntary trade, it's increasing your position, your capital position or whatever.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and if it's trustworthy, then you can rely on it. You know, one of the things that's really awful about inflation, as far as I can tell, imagine yourself back in Germany at the end of World War I, and you're one of those ants, not the grasshopper, and you've saved and scrimped, and you've foregone gratification, you've built up your storehouse of value for your pension, maybe you've taken care of your family. You did that through sacrifice. Right, because other people are out there fiddling away and drinking beer, and not you, man. You're nose to the grindstone, and you put aside your store of value, and then poof, hyperinflation. It's like, weren't you stupid?
Yeah.
Because you could have been out there fiddling and drinking, and instead you were scrimping and saving, and now you got nothing.
Right.
And at least those other people have what's left of their memory. And the thing that's so catastrophic about that, possibly, is that that's actually a betrayal of precisely that which you least want to betray. Because you want to encourage people to have some faith in the future and make decisions that make the delay of gratification morally laudable and intelligent. And then, well, inflation it hurts those people the most.
You're penalizing prudence.
Absolutely, because people with debt, it's like, yeah, man, bring on the inflation. Yeah. It's the people who were careful.
Right.
And then if you think those are conscientious people, let's say, and there's an excellent literature looking at what makes people productive. Mm-hmm. And there are two cardinal dimensions of human variability that make people productive. One is general cognitive ability. That's often known as intelligence and formally measured as IQ. And part of the reason that makes people more productive is because they're faster, and more or less by definition, if one person does something and another person does it, the person who does it faster, if it's valuable, is doing it better. And general cognitive ability seems to be, in no small part, an index of something processing speed, right? And conscientiousness. And trait conscientiousness, and that's dutifulness. It's a conservative virtue, by which I mean people who are high in trait conscientiousness tend to have conservative political leanings, by the way. And those are the people you punish like mad with inflation, because they're the pillars of your society. If your society, if you can define your society in some sense as a storehouse of deferred value,
right,
which is a good way of describing, like, what the hell good is a civilization if it doesn't do that, right? I mean,
capital accumulation.
Yeah, exactly. It has to allow you to accumulate what's necessary for security and thriving. So you want it to do that if you want a civilization. And then it's the conscientious people who strive to do that, and it's those you punish with inflation.
Right. Inflation is decivilizing.
Yes.
Agreed with that completely.
Yes, that seems multi-dimensionally accurate.
If we could pivot into another topic you've done beautiful, excellent work on, the logos. And I know I'm not going to try to define this, or I know that's an infinite rabbit hole, but just this idea of the word effectively being the medium of exchange of human intention, right? When we're communicating, I use words to communicate an idea to you. I'm intending to propagate a message to you.
Yeah, you probably use words to communicate value, which ties it more tightly to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, and then I would map that also to money is something, a medium of exchange of human action, right? This is something that's actually been done in the world, capital created, value created or not created, right? Your profit and loss is telling you. Are your actions benefiting society? Are you profitable, as we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Or are you generating a loss, meaning that it's not valuable enough to people based on the economic inputs into the product or service?
Yeah.
So, totalitarianism, another topic you've done a lot of great work on, they always attack freedom of speech, right?
It's unnecessary.
Freedom of speech is not necessary.
Not if you're a totalitarian.
Right, because you know everything.
You already know everything.
You know everything.
You don't need any new ideas. Get the hell away from me with those.
And so there's countless examples of totalitarians attacking the freedom of speech. Indeed, it's one of the first things they do, right?
Yeah,
they try to take over the media.
It's almost an unerring hallmark of the totalitarian mind.
And the other unerring hallmark is the central bank. So Marx's 1848 Manifesto of the Communist Party, measure number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly.
Yeah, that sounds like Marx.
So my question is, okay, words...
Jesus, what a dismal sentence that is.
So we have words...
How many people died because of that sentence? Like tens of millions of people.
Over 100 million, right?
That sentence.
So...
Jesus.
The word is a medium of exchange for intention, money is a medium of exchange for action. If totalitarianism necessitates the corruption and control of the words and money, can't we at least limit the threat of totalitarianism by using a technology that makes our money incorruptible?
Well, that's the idea.
And by extension, this goes a little bit deeper on Bitcoin, but in theory, and there's projects out there, that you can build communication protocols on top of Bitcoin that make your communications unstoppable. So we could have true freedom of speech in the digital space.
Yeah.
Isn't that a bulwark against totalitarianism?
Look. Yes, I would say so. And you run into the free rider problem, head on, and that's a big problem because we talked a little bit about this earlier, that there are exploitative types, the psychopathic types, and they're about 3% of the population cross-culturally. And it isn't obvious how you control them in a system like the one that you're describing.
Free market system?
Yeah.
I think you could still have prisons, police, all of those things, but it's just not systemized on, the property right violations aren't systemized via inflation and these things.
Yeah. So. Well, I mean, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's a worthy experiment and doesn't seem to have any self-evident psychological or logical flaws. When we've been building an argument from first principles here to some degree, we could talk about the logos again and about the proclivity of totalitarians to squelch free speech. It could be that our communication is always about value, right? Because what else would you communicate about? I mean, what do you want to know from someone? You want to know what they value. That might be all you want to know about them. Is that an overstatement? Probably not.
I think action's an expression of value, and ultimately we're talking about acting in the world.
Yeah.
So I don't
Right. Well, that's it. That's right. And I mean, certainly advertisers pay for your attention. They're paying for the process by which they're paying to engage themselves in the process by which you determine value. And so language is a medium for the exchange of information about value, we could say. And so is money any different than that? And the answer to that could well be no. They might be the same thing. And so is Bitcoin an incorruptible language? Probably not, because that would be a hell of a thing if it was true, right? I mean, so it strikes me as unlikely that we've managed that. But it isn't obvious to see where there's a flaw in that.
Well, you know what's different, I think, between words and money, let's say, is that words are a low-cost signal. You can say a lot of words, you can mislead people and all of this, but money tends to be a costly signal.
True.
If you put your skin in the game, you put capital at risk, right, to do something. That's a much more, what would we say,
credible,
high-cost signal. So,
yeah, well,
yes.
I think part of the problem with social media platforms is that the cost of words is zero.
Right. Yes.
And that's the wrong cost.
Yes.
Partly because the psychopath types in particular are terrible on social media platforms because they can say and do things that would get them thrashed if they were doing them in the real world, and there's no cost.
We have, I mean, there's a lot of experiments in the space. I've got a friend here running a company called Zion, and they are aiming to fix that, actually. It's just add a cost to communication in digital space, and you flush all that out. You increase the quality of discourse in digital reality just by making it non-zero, as you're describing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'd love to say this to you. We think Bitcoin fixes that, Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, well, that would be...
It's early, but it's promising at least, so...
Yeah, do you have any sense of why people would move to platforms where communication was, maybe because the psychopaths would be there?
It's a complicated question to break the network effects of something like Twitter and whatnot, but there are financial incentives to own your own data too, because right now your attention's being sold on these networks. You keep, like, you're not paid for being on Twitter. I mean, maybe you are, but most people aren't. In this world of owning your own data, like a decentralized, Bitcoinized Twitter, you would, in theory, be able to selectively monetize your attention.
Right.
So that incentive could break the network effect of something like Twitter.
Good. Yeah, that'd be good. Well, we don't want to build social communication networks that aren't viable, that aren't valid analogs of our real world communication networks. You know, and I've been thinking this through psychologically, I suppose, for the last couple of months. What happens if you have a widespread communication system that doesn't abide by the same incentive structures that real world communication abides by? And I think Twitter is a good example of that, primarily because the cost of being provocative
in real life
is zero. And so that's an externalized cost. You know, we have these ideas about the market not being a comprehensive indicator of value. There's externalized costs, pollution, for example, market failure. Well, Twitter externalizes its pollution because it isn't an analog of real world communication systems. It introduces insanity into the communication structure, because I think technically a communication system that doesn't abide by the rules of real-world communication systems is insane. That's the definition of it. Yeah, there's a parasitical element for sure. And so getting the incentives right, this is a crucial issue, right? And of course that's why we're talking about all of this, is that the cost of communication in a virtual world has to be analogous to the cost of communication in the real world,
Right.
or the system is insane.
Right.
I think that might be true.
Right.
So,
there's a cost of being a schmuck in the real world, but not so much on Twitter, and that's
right. There's a
incoherent.
real, people say things on Twitter all the time that they would never say once in their life, because
Right.
if they ever said them, someone would kill them. So,
Completely
it would
agree.
come to blows immediately.
Yeah.
And
I would plug one series I did actually with Michael Saylor. He goes in depth how he thinks Bitcoin could fix this, and it's a longer discussion, but I would
no
plug
doubt.
that here. Can we talk about time? So, as your work brilliantly points out, the fall of man was effectively the discovery of time, which was also the realization that we must work. Right? And for all these reasons we're describing, we're always vulnerable. We must always prepare for the future. And through work, we're effectively sacrificing the present to the future, right? That's delayed gratification, that's capital accumulation, that's the ethic of capitalism. But debt is the exact opposite, right? We're sacrificing the future to the present. We're accelerating gratification, engaging in dis-saving, and it's effectively the opposite of work, right? To take on debt and buy something instead of working and saving for it. So another framing for fiat currency that I think is useful is that it is a debt-based money. So as you were describing earlier, inflation destroys savers, right? It destroys prudence, and it actually incentivizes its opposite. I am incentivized to accumulate as much debt as possible, knowing that inflation will erode that real debt burden over time.
Yeah,
So-
well, there's certainly a moral hazard there, especially for governments.
And I think, so the Austrians would say that this is raising your time preference, which is to say makes you think shorter term.
Yeah.
And that concept of time preference is inexorably related to the moral standard. So the Austrians have actually written the monetary standard and the moral standard are inexorably linked. If you're debasing the currency, you're inducing immorality, like gambling, debt accumulation, short-sightedness, all of these things.
Yeah,
So as
that seems right.
So as we said earlier, it's decivilizing in more ways than one. So my question would be, if we're going to construct a sustainable civilization, one that's going to stand the test of time, shouldn't we aim to remove the avenues of wealth acquisition that involve, I'll say taking, which would be inflation, taxation, theft, rent seeking?
It's interesting, because one of the things that's happening now with the rise of these ESGs, there are all sorts of people who are hypothetically concerned that our time horizon isn't long enough and we're burning the planet at our own expense, right? We're destroying the planet for future generations. I suppose, assuming they care about future generations, which I generally doubt, but in any case, that's our moral crime, and it's associated with a kind of an impulsive hedonism. And so the cure for that appears to be more central planning. And I think that's a really bad idea, because if the market system is a computational mechanism that allows us to value the transforming horizon of the future, then imposing a fiat solution on that interferes with our ability to adapt.
Right.
And so you might think, well, no, because my solution is correct. It's like, well, even if you're right, which you aren't, but even if you were, right for how long?
Right.
Like 2 weeks, a month, things change, man. You think your solution is right forever? And so now we've got this situation where corporations are increasingly being judged on their sustainability.
Right.
It's like, try computing sustainability. This is the time preference problem, right? I mean, it's not possible. It's actually not possible. Partly because as you compute out into the future, your error margins grow until, what are you going to plan 60 years down the road? How the hell can you do that? No one envisioned the world we're in 60 years ago. I mean, I read science fiction when I was a kid 40 years ago. Everyone was in rockets traveling from planet to planet, but nobody had a home-based computer or computing device that was more powerful than the entire Apollo program in the palm of their hand. So we just got that 100% wrong. And so we don't know how to, by fiat, determine sustainability. And I think we're going to make a bloody mess of things trying to do that. Your point would be, well, the proper way to incentivize sustainability would be to produce an incorruptible store of value. And so, hey, it's a good theory.
And in addition to that, giving people an option for a property right that cannot be preyed upon by the state, right? So we know in every business, like if you go to buy a car and you can't come to terms with a guy, you can always walk out of the door, right? You can always go to his competitor, and that effectively keeps him honest. Whereas if he's the monopolist, he's the only guy on the block, then he'll charge you whatever he wants. He doesn't care about your preferences. We haven't had this exit option in money, ever. You could bury gold in your backyard, but that's not very practical. Hard to lug it around, et cetera, et cetera. So Bitcoin's kind of this like honesty forcing function on state behavior. And that if they're excessively oppressive or excessive regulation, taxation, whatever it is, people can exit into this property right that's independent of the state.
Yeah, well, I've read already, and I'm no economist and I'm certainly no Bitcoin expert, but I've read already that countries that attempted to clamp down hard on Bitcoin saw a depreciation in their own currency's value on currency trading markets because the market read that as insufficient faith in the validity of their own currency.
Right.
And that's pretty damn interesting. I think it's true. You know, so even if Bitcoin becomes nothing other than that kind of corrective, that wouldn't be nothing. That would be quite something. So I don't see any logical flaws in that formulation. I mean, Robert and I were talking about this a little bit backstage. I don't want to preempt the discussion, but you know, I'm as a trained social scientist and a pessimistic one in some sense, I'm always looking for the unexpected consequence. That's also what makes me somewhat conservative, I would say, in my political leanings. Bitcoin is a radical social experiment, and do you worry, Bitcoiners in general, do you worry that by replacing a fiat currency, or the fiat currency, or any fiat currency maybe, ultimately, are we going to destabilize things that fiat currencies are doing that we don't understand? You know, like how much utility is there? Is there utility in allowing your government, assuming it's regulated by vote and it's a free society, is there utility in allowing the government to make fundamental financial decisions that Bitcoin would threaten, you know, in a negative way? And like I said, I'm not an economist, and I know there are arguments about why that won't be the case, but arguments in reality aren't the same thing.
As I said to you backstage, you know, and quoting you actually, there is stability in the hierarchy, even if that hierarchy is somewhat tyrannical. So this is a massive change, right? If this is actually the disruption of gold, well, the whole world's built on top of gold right now. Central banking's built on top of gold. Nation states are built on top of the central bank. So there could be a period of instability, let's say. Very hard to say where it goes. But this idea of removing coercion from the socioeconomic fabric, I mean, it increases wealth, increases human happiness, increases psychological stability in the long run, right?
That's the problem, right? That's the problem, right?
Right.
It's the time preference problem.
Yes.
And it's always, this is also the problem with the apocalyptic doomsaying of the environmentalists. It's like, well, you were wrong. Well, we're out by 30 years.
Right. And they can always say that.
Well, that's right. They can always say that.
And the Fed does this too. Every time there's an economic disaster and they intervene, they say, well, it would have been worse had we not intervened.
Right, exactly.
It's unfalsifiable, right?
Yes. Well, this is also partly why we fall prey so frequently to apocalyptic thinking. You know, and it might be a fatal flaw in our cognitive mechanism. It's like, well, prove the apocalypse isn't going to happen. Sorry. You know, there are runaway processes and they emerge unpredictably, and so the climate catastrophists could, in principle, be right. My problem with that is, well, there's an indefinite number of apocalyptic catastrophes, and so what are we going to do? Pay attention to every single one of them at the same time? Like, why should your apocalyptic catastrophe take precedence? Yeah. And, you know, the answer to that generally is because I think I'm right. It's like, well, that's just not good enough. And so back to the Bitcoin issue. Would we produce a more sustainable society if we had a less corruptible store of long-term value? I can't see how we couldn't. Right. We'd extend our time frame out to some degree, right? Because now the currency is unstable. Right. And that's factored into all the economic decisions that we make.
Yeah.
And if we stabilize the currency so it didn't vary as much over the time frames that we can compute, I suspect that would make us more future-oriented.
Yeah, you're incentivizing prudence, right? The opposite of inflation.
Yeah.
And reward those that are competent, move us away from a dominance hierarchy to a competence hierarchy.
That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of us who believe that such things exist.
I want to touch on another topic. I mean, this has been very transformative in my life personally, I think for a lot of people, but your work on responsibility. Just the idea of taking as much responsibility as you can in every situation, it's just transformative from the inside out. I want to try to tie this to something a lot of my work touches on, which is just the concept of property. And I think I've mentioned this to you previously. We always talk about property rights, is what you typically hear. But as you've said, rights and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. If you have a right to 3 hot meals a day, well, that's someone's responsibility to prepare those meals. It doesn't just
which is
fall out
why
of the
you
sky.
don't have that right.
Right, exactly. So there's this idea, like, if you own a car, for instance, right, you have the rights to enjoy that car, but you're also responsible for the maintenance of that vehicle, right? That is what the property relationship is incentivizing or instantiating.
Yeah.
So if we have this civilization where we have rampant violations of private property via inflation largely, but also taxation and regulation, aren't we inducing irresponsibility? And how can we have unstable or let's say violable property and a culture premised on responsibility at the same time when we're undermining the very economic relationship that instantiates responsibility?
Yeah, well, that's a reflection of the same argument. I mean, again, I guess I would wonder, are there forms of irresponsibility unexpected forms of irresponsibility that would manifest themselves if we switch to Bitcoin? So, for example, to what degree would that make tax evasion not only possible but virtually certain?
I think it makes taxation gone forever.
Okay, well, fair enough, but then so then you'd say, well, new forms of social organization, make themselves manifest as a consequence of that transformation. But that's kind of a hand-waving answer, right? I mean, we use taxation to pay for a lot of things that we haven't been able to bring under the rubric of market force. And sometimes that's long-term, really, really long-term investment, infrastructure investment, that sort of thing. And so what do you envision replacing taxation?
I would say that my views are very much aligned with libertarian philosophers, that we can solve a lot of these problems through mutual voluntary exchange. It's very hard to talk
so
about.
You see the free market expanding.
Yes, because if there's a want, right, and people are voting on this want with their buying and selling behavior, then you can solve any problem of any size. You don't need non-consensual exchange to solve a bigger problem. That's nonsensical. But we've lived in this rubric of statism throughout our whole history, where we've always had to deal with this monkey on our back.
Well, fine. Let's delve into that a little bit. If it hasn't been necessary, why do you think it happened?
Because property has been violable. It can be done. So if there's a path to wealth acquisition that I don't have to work, I can just take your stuff, then that's a business model. So you see it as
a moral hazard, essentially.
I see Bitcoin as a very expensive, if not impossible, property to violate. So that holds a check on statism, right, which is based on the violation of property. The whole business model derives all its revenue from the violation of property. And Bitcoin, in theory, held correctly, there's a lot of building to be done, is effectively inviolable property.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll get lucky, and what'll happen is that Bitcoin will roll itself out incrementally, within the confines of the free market system as it currently exists, and we'll be able to test these prognostications one by one without any revolutionary catastrophes, and we'll be able to find out. I don't know, for example, have you been keeping an eye on what's happening in El Salvador? How's that experiment working? Because I don't know. I wish there was an economist here as well. Not that you're not one, but one that was opposed to your views.
Right.
You take me outside of my domain of competence to a large degree. But so what's happening in El Salvador?
I can't attest to great knowledge there, but I do plan on visiting this year. I hear good things, is all I can say so far. But agreed, experimentation will tell us if it's working or not, right? Were the libertarians right or not? I guess we'll see. Maybe this is a good transition to a really deep topic, which is the Philosopher's Stone. Because we have faith in some ideal that you're accurately saying. We don't really know if it will work. We have this long literature of Austrian economics and libertarianism saying that we needed the sly roundabout way to take money out of the hands of government to build a sustainable civilization, but we don't actually know because we've never seen it. And this, I mean, maybe you could just introduce the Philosopher's Stone. Wasn't this premised on working towards this ideal of some incorruptible substance that would save the world or serve as an antidote to tyranny? And this is an excerpt from your book, Maps of Meaning, by the way.
I recognized it. I wrote each of those sentences like 50 times. Yeah. They're pretty much embedded in my brain. Well, we've certainly been searching forever for an incorruptible storehouse of value.
Yes.
That's definitely the case. And that is associated, at least in part, with our realization for the necessity of work, because work doesn't work without a storehouse of value.
Right.
And interestingly enough, a lot of where you store value is in your reputation. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean,
the original store of value.
Yeah, the original store of value, well, even now, for that matter, your brand, the value of your brand is the value of your reputation. The brand just represents your reputation, and so the incorruptible storehouse of value is your reputation, and there is a religious element to that idea, because that's in some sense the idea of storing up treasure in heaven. Mm-hmm. Now, the more incorruptible you are as a person, the better your reputation, and that's the most reliable storehouse of value you have. And that's right, that's true, and it's kind of surprising that we don't know that so pragmatically. I guess it's partly because we're still possessed by a kind of Marxist guilt about our productive enterprises. We are kind of enticed into believing that if we store value, there's something selfish about that.
Right.
But that's not the case at all if it's the case that the best place to store value is in your reputation, and therefore you want to be the most ethical actor possible. And I would say that would also be the person who's most fun to play with. When we can think about that technically for a second, and I think this is worth doing. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but parents often tell their children when they're playing a game, they say, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it matters how you play the game. And they often tell that to children who are bad losers or bad winners, because you can be both. And if you're a bad winner, then maybe you're highly skilled, but you hog the ball and you're not a good team player and you're just no fun. You win, but you're just no fun. And if you're a bad loser, the same thing. And what parents are telling their children in some sense is, don't win at the cost of being no fun. And you might say, well, why is that relevant? And the answer is, well, if people don't find you fun to play with, then they won't play with you and you lose. And so you might win the game, but you lose life. You lose your life. And so your reputation is a reflection of your desirability as a voluntary play partner.
How many
really
games you're invited to, right?
You bet, right. You bet. And to think about it as invitation is right. I've been talking to some religious people, lots of them, and Islamic people and Jewish people and Christian people primarily. And I've been trying to conceptualize the relationship between religious schools. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that I talked to an Islamic traditionalist a while back. Muhammad Hijab was his name, and it was very interesting. one of the things that was extremely interesting about it, it's kind of a rough conversation to begin with because he was sort of hammering at me for a while. But after that died down, we actually had a conversation, and it was quite a productive conversation. We talked about the use of force in belief, because I say, well, among Islamic traditionalists, is your belief a matter of voluntary choice? And he insisted that the answer to that was yes, fundamentally. And I thought, well, that's lovely to hear that stated as an explicit principle, because then hypothetically all of us could start to conceptualize the conflict, the competition between religious traditions. Most properly undertaken would be a competition between invitations. You think, so if you want to evangelize most effectively, how do you do that? Well, the answer is by example, and by being the sort of person that other people want to be around and be like. And that's, if you want to shine the light of your religious belief, it's either that or compulsion. Right, and maybe we won't trust the people who use compulsion. How about that? Whereas, so we unroll this back. You store value in your reputation, and that means you store value in the ethics of your behavior. The Bitcoin notion, I suppose, in some sense, is you have an unerring marker for that now.
Right.
So, well,
I would. Hey,
that'd be something.
If I could add here, perhaps, too, that we would also seek to store our economic value in the money with the best reputation. Right. That's what the U.S. dollar is currently. What gold is historically.
Yeah, and those are promises.
Yes.
Like fundamentally, you could ask, well, what is money? Money is a promise.
Yes, right.
So it's based on trust.
Contract with the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, and with strangers, right? With people you don't know, which is really quite remarkable. Right. And so it's all dependent on interpersonal trust, and well, that's dependent on all sorts of fundamental things.
Right.
But because it's dependent on trust, you would think the most trustworthy currency, well, hopefully that would be the one that rises to the top.
Yeah, there's a work by a great thinker in the space named Nick Szabo, and he actually describes money as the trust minimized asset. And what he means by that is that wherever you can store your economic value that's maximally insulated from the opinions and actions of others, you don't need to trust others, right? We don't need to trust. I don't need to trust that you trust gold. Gold just has a market cap by the free market.
We can trust by assumption.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, and that actually constitutes wealth.
Minimizing interpersonal trust to maximize.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I had this experience. I played a lot with eBay, and eBay was, when it first made itself manifest, people were trying to market. What do you call that? I write you a check that bounces and
auction.
You send me junk, and and eBay dies, and so you have a third party verify the transactions, right? Escrow.
Yeah, escrow. Okay.
So people marketed their escrow services for eBay, and for a percentage of the transaction, they would verify the exchange. But it turned out that people were so honest, it was unnecessary, like seriously unnecessary. And then if you played on eBay for any length of time, you soon came to realize they started eventually putting in reputational markers, right, which was percentage of satisfied customers. And if you fell below, like if 98% of your customers were satisfied, you were doing a bad job. Like if you were a good seller, it was 99 or 100. Some of them, many people with 10,000 transactions had 100% ratings. And so that was so cool to see, because and it shows you how civilized a society can be, where the default exchange between geographically distant strangers who will never meet again is honesty.
Yeah.
And you think that's the sign of wealth. Right. That's the unerring sign of wealth. If you live in a culture where the default transaction between strangers is honest exchange, everyone's rich.
And this was premised on the transparency. This case with eBay was premised both on the transparency of the system and presumably the predictability of the rules, right? The reputation system, how it works.
Yeah, yes. So certainly eBay was set up so it didn't interfere with that.
Right.
But I think it was predicated on something even deeper than that, which was that people, and this is, I really like this, because, the postmodern types, the Marxists, as we talked about earlier, I know that postmodernists and Marxists aren't the same, but what happens to postmodernists is they sneak Marxism in to fill all the gaps that their theory would otherwise have, and then they pretend they're not doing it, but they are. And in any case, you know, the Marxist presupposition is that it's mutual exploitation that defines our economic relationship. But what if it's mutual trust? And I think eBay is a great example of that. It's like, no, wasn't exploitation, because that was certainly possible. It was mutual trust. And, you know, eBay unfroze a lot of capital.
Yes.
Right? And the reason, it wasn't even so much that it was a technological revolution, although it was in some sense. The reason it could do that is because the default transaction between Americans is trust. And that's something, man. That's a hell of an accomplishment. So that's another example of the storage of value in reputation.
Yes.
You know, you guys, speaking broadly, your culture is so bloody civilized that you can depend on the integrity of strangers almost all the time. And just think about how easy that makes your life. Because when you were talking about trust earlier, it's like, well, you have to earn my trust, let's say, in a society that's skeptical. You know how bloody hard it is to earn someone's trust?
Very expensive.
Oh my God, it takes forever, and one exception can violate it. And here we are in this unbelievably fortunate circumstance that characterizes free societies where, no, I'll just trust you. How'll that be? It's like, well, what kind of fool are you? You just trust a stranger. It's like...
And technologies are so impactful on this, because who would have imagined we now summon a car on a smartphone and jump into the back seat with a stranger for an Uber ride.
Absolutely.
But again, based on that reputation system.
Or use Airbnb.
Right.
You know? Or like one of the things I always thought of as completely miraculous, I've never been able to get accustomed to renting a car at an airport. It's like, it's so ridiculous. You can just fly somewhere that you've never been, where no one knows you, and you can give this guy a card, and he'll give you an $80,000 car that's brand new. It's like, here it is. Sorry it took 5 minutes. Yeah, well, next time maybe you could do it a little quicker. We'll do our best. And that's a complete bloody miracle that works. You think about how unlikely that is, and yet people just take it for granted, and it's all predicated on this underlying trust and on reputational integrity.
Yes, and I want to give credit to your work here again, because it goes all the way down to the Judeo-Christian substructure. Right? It's almost like we've been building this system of trust up to the point where we have this culture around us that we're almost blind to, but it minimizes the transaction cost of establishing trust, which unlocks economic abundance.
Absolutely, yeah. There might be no natural resource other than trust. Like, it's the fundamental. I read a good economic analysis at one point of Japan. You know, Japan has almost no natural resources, but it's a society characterized by a tremendous amount of interpersonal integrity. Yeah. And so they can get a long way, and they do, and did.
Right.
And so trust, that's why it's also so terrifying to see the erosion of public trust in public institutions, and a lot of that's a consequence of the ill-advised use of compulsion. Absolutely.
I'd like to get into one last deep topic here, which is Christ.
Sure.
I would
go somewhere.
Your book, this is the conclusion to Maps of Meaning, and you write that Jesus said, "Do not tell lies, and do not do what you hate. For all things are plain in the sight of heaven. For nothing hidden will not become manifest, and nothing covered will remain without being uncovered." And you also, another line in your book, you said that the known serves as the protection against the unknown. And that line always really struck me, because I think money is kind of the technological implementation of that. Like, we've been looking for the most certain asset to store economic value in. That's effectively what gold was. It had the most predictable supply across time, couldn't be destroyed very easily, so it was fairly indestructible, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as Bitcoiners, that's what we think Bitcoin has perfected. We have created a money that's composed of perfect information. All right, we know it has 21 million. We know exactly what its issuance is. There's nothing hidden in Bitcoin, and that is its value. It's just absolute transparency with no deception, no falsehood. And we touched on the Philosopher's Stone a little bit, but one of the ways that it was defined was we've been pursuing this for thousands of years, to instantiate the principles of Christ in matter or in an abstract concept or an ideal.
Well, it is a system of value.
Yes.
And so that analogy has to be appropriate at some level. I mean, we've already wandered through the notion that there's a tight relationship between your ethics and your reputation, and a tight relationship between your reputation and the storage of value. And like that's really worth thinking through. And you have to decide for yourself, I think, whether or not you believe it's true. As an ethical actor, are you most protected against the vagaries of existence by being an ethical actor? I would say that actually, in some profound sense, defines what it means to be an ethical actor. Why would we consider something that didn't have that characteristic ethical? We'd just die if that was the case. That would be so counterproductive. I think what we regard as ethical in the highest sense is that which enables us to store value across the longest period of time. I mean, how could it be otherwise? And so that means that if you believe that, that will change your life, because you start taking what you do a lot more seriously if you believe that. And so is there a necessary interplay between the ethic, like the religious ethic, and the monetary system? What does it say on the dollar bill? Isn't it in God we trust?
Yeah, but the actuality is in Fed we trust.
Yeah, well, so it's corrupted, and you Bitcoin purists might be right about your presuppositions. We've wandered through a fair bit of conceptual territory today. I don't see any obvious manner in which the presuppositions of the Bitcoin community violate fundamental psychological principles. Quite the contrary. But, like I said, I'm not an economist, that's for sure, and there's lots of things I don't know, so I'd hesitate to give it my unwarranted stamp of approval, for whatever that's worth, and very little. But it's an extremely interesting experiment, and I find it quite compelling, the idea of a incorruptible storehouse of value.
There's another really interesting aspect to this that I don't know how much you've looked into, but like the work of John Vallis, who you met earlier, he really explores the personal transformations in the lives of Bitcoiners. And it's leading, myself included, has led me back to traditional values, right? Led me back to Christianity. It's changed my lifestyle in a lot of ways. Changes your diet, changes...
Why do you think that is?
I think it's something to do with time preference. Like just this idea of being able to store your energy in something that's incorruptible and predictable
that you can have
broadens your time horizons.
Yeah.
So it's making you more timeless or something. And that relates back to the Philosopher's Stone, where you describe this, to create a technological development in the Philosopher's Stone required a moral development. There was like this co-creative process.
Yeah.
So I've found it very interesting to see that happen in the lives of Bitcoiners, and it's...
Yeah, well, it does, and the time preference issue does make sense, because it's certainly the case that I believe that morality emerges out of iterated voluntary games. So what we regard as moral is the principle that most aptly governs the longest term iterated games.
Right.
And that's something like the sustainability that that people are struggling to attain.
Right.
And I think we have moral intuitions that indicate to us when that is being manifested in people's behavior. Yeah. That we find them reliable and trustworthy. Right. We find them ethical. And I do think that's associated with a longer time horizon. Maturity, certainly, there's almost no difference between maturity and a longer time horizon. Right. They're almost identical in some sense. And so it could be that Bitcoin, by increasing your faith in the future, does disincline you to fiddle while Rome burns.
Right.
Could be.
And another thing you talk about a lot, this idea of mimesis, where we're constantly imitating one another. It seems to me if we had hierarchies of competence rather than dominance, that the prudent are not being penalized, they're actually at the top of the wealth hierarchy, that would actually change the values that are imitated. So you could actually purify society to some extent, maybe, the behaviors that actually win you wealth in the world versus,
Well, I mean,
we have Putin with a $200 billion net worth that's purely extractive. I think that's pretty bad that people would copy his behaviors. Whereas in a world where you couldn't take money to get to that level in the wealth hierarchy, it would be propagating better behaviors throughout society.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you detach exploitation from success, you're certainly going to decrease the probability that exploitative patterns are going to be imitated.
Yes.
They're going to be imitated, and we know this already, that it's definitely in places where the time horizon is extremely shortened that hyper-aggressive strategies make themselves manifest.
Of course, yeah.
So, yeah, or even just competition at the street level, Without that time horizon, you grab and run, fundamentally.
Right.
And so, like I said, this makes sense. That doesn't mean it's correct. but the fact that it is being played out in this experimental manner, in this competitive manner, I think the danger to the Bitcoin community, and this will probably happen sooner rather than later, is that you'll get clamped down on hard. And that strikes me as highly probable. I think the way that's likely to happen is that the governments will try to implement their own digital currencies, and then do everything they can to squash out competitors. And you think fiat currency is bad, you wait till it's fiat currency with a digital spin, man. Wait until people can track all of your purchases and decide using some scheme of fiat when you're acting unethically with regards to your choice of, let's say, consumer item.
Right.
Do you really need that automobile? That'll be the next question, coming out down the pipes in the next 10 years. What makes you think you should have an automobile when the whole planet is at stake?
Right.
It's like, who made you final arbiter of value?
Right.
Yeah.
And to fight that tyranny, we need faith in an ideal. And I guess that's what Bitcoin represents to us. So.
Yeah, well, hopefully it's a practicality too.
Yeah.
But, that's the other thing. That's the other thing that's kind of admirable about the Bitcoin community. Delusional though it may be, let's say, at least you're bloody well put your money where your mouth is. Well, that's something, isn't it? It's not just, as you said, it's not just cheap talk.
Right.
You're willing to stake your future and maybe the future of your family on this, and so it looks like you're really in the game. And if you're really in the game, well, then maybe that does facilitate a certain kind of ethical transformation. It's highly probable, just to start to think in that long-term way and to start to think about questions of ultimate value. It's like, how could that not have a transformative effect? It certainly does on people, and so wouldn't it be lovely if this all worked out? And maybe it will.
Dr. Peterson, I have to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your work. Thank you for the work you do for humanity. Propagating this message of freedom, truth, responsibility, it matters a lot for a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for the invitation. Thank you very much, everyone.